He arrived with less than 600 men and brought an empire of millions to its knees. But was Hernán Cortés a brilliant strategist, a brutal opportunist, or just a man swept up in a storm of gold, gods, and betrayal? This is the true story of the fall of the Aztec Empire. Before a single Spanish boot touched the soil of central Mexico, a world already flourished, vast, complex, and alive with power. It was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was an empire. At the center of this world stood Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, built upon the waters of Lake Texcoco like a jewel rising from the lakebed. With towering temples, busy canals, bustling markets, and a population that rivaled the largest cities in Europe, the capital was a feat of engineering and ambition. It was clean, orderly, and vibrant. A metropolis connected by causeways and ruled by religion as much as by the sword. The Mexica, the dominant ethnic group of the Aztec Empire, were relatively new to the Valley of Mexico, but they had risen quickly. Through military conquest and political alliances, they had formed a mighty triple alliance with the city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan, exacting tribute from dozens of subject peoples. Gold, jade, cotton, cacao, feathers, and food flowed into the capital. Wealth that dazzled not only the Mexica rulers, but would soon attract European hunger as well. The society was rigidly stratified. At the top stood Moctezuma II, the Tlatoani, the speaker, an emperor regarded as semi-divine. Beneath him were nobles, warriors, priests, merchants, and artisans. At the bottom, farmers and enslaved people. Yet every citizen played a role in a society built around balance between nature, cosmos, and human duty. But it was religion that defined the empire most dramatically. The Aztec worldview was steeped in ritual. They believed the sun required nourishment in the form of human blood, and that sacrifice was necessary to maintain the cosmic order. Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, demanded warriors' hearts. Temples rose like mountains to honor the gods, and the Templo Mayor, at the center of Tenochtitlan, was the spiritual axis of the empire. Warfare wasn't just for territory, it was for captives. The flower wars were fought not to kill, but to feed the gods. For the Aztecs, to die in sacrifice was not a punishment, but a pathway to divinity. And yet, all was not peaceful beneath the surface. Many tributary states resented Aztec rule. The Tlaxcalans, Huexotzincas, and other neighbors had long memories of conquest and humiliation. They paid tribute in goods and lives, and though they feared the Aztecs, they also waited and hoped for a day of reckoning. The empire was glorious, but it was brittle. Prophecies whispered of omens, comets, strange lights, disfigured creatures, signs that the gods were angry or that a significant change was coming. Even Moctezuma II, a brilliant but cautious ruler, began to doubt his own grip on the future. So when word came of strange men landing on distant shores, men with pale faces, iron weapons, and beasts never seen before, the empire stood alert. A storm was brewing, but no one yet knew it would sweep away a civilization. In 1519, Hernán Cortés stood on the shores of Cuba, staring westward toward rumors, riches, and rebellion. He was no nobleman, no prince of power, but in the growing Spanish Empire, ambition often outweighed birth. Born in 1485 in Medellin, Spain, Cortés was restless, intelligent, and driven. He had studied law briefly, but craved action more than parchment. Like many of his generation, he was a product of the Reconquista, Spain's long battle to reclaim land from Muslim rule, and carried with him a warrior's worldview. Conquest justified by faith, and dominion framed as divine mission. By the time he arrived in the Caribbean, Spain had already tasted New World wealth. Gold, spices, and native labor fueled dreams of empires. but whispers circulated of a mainland to the west, a land of cities, riches, and strange gods. Earlier expeditions along the Yucatan coast had brought back tales of advanced peoples and fierce resistance. The Spanish crown was hungry for more. Cortés was chosen by the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, to lead a new expedition. But just before departure, Velázquez grew suspicious of Cortés's ambitions and tried to revoke his commission. Cortés ignored the order. In February 1519, he set sail anyway with 11 ships, about 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and an arsenal of muskets, cannons, and steel. He brought priests, scribes, translators, and enough arrogance to believe that God and destiny rode with him. His first landfall was the island of Cozumel, where he began to gather interpreters and intelligence. On the mainland, he clashed with the Maya at Potonchan, where the Spanish won a costly battle but also received 20 women as tribute. Among them, a woman who would become key to everything, Malintzin, later baptized as Doña Marina. Malintzin spoke both Maya and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and when paired with a Spanish-speaking castaway, Geronimo de Aguilar, Cortés had a living bridge to the indigenous world. It was a game-changer. Then came a pivotal moment. At Veracruz, Cortés took a radical step. He renounced the authority of Velázquez. He claimed he was acting directly under the authority of the Spanish crown. He founded a new town council that immediately granted him military and political command. This legal sleight of hand gave him legitimacy, at least on paper. But to prevent mutiny or retreat, he made an infamous decision. He scuttled his ships, leaving no way back for his men. They were committed, whether they wanted to be or not. Cortés's ambition was no longer confined to coastal raids. He had his eyes on the interior, on the rumors of a mighty empire inland, and the city called Tenochtitlan. He did not yet know the magnitude of what lay ahead, but he believed he was chosen by the King of Spain, by the God of heaven, and by the pull of history itself. The expedition moved inland, and with every step, the fate of an empire tilted closer to collapse. Among all the figures who shaped the conquest of Mexico, few were as pivotal, or as misunderstood, as Malintzin, also known as Doña Marina. Born around 1500 in the region of Coatzacoalcos, in present-day Veracruz, Malintzin belonged to a noble Nahua family. But her early life was torn apart by conflict. After her father's death, she was likely sold or given away, either by family or as an enslaved person in the shifting power dynamics of local tribes. Eventually, she came into the hands of the Tabascan Maya, who would unknowingly change history by offering her to the Spanish. In March 1519, after the Battle of Potonchan, the defeated Maya leaders gave Cortés 20 women, one of whom was Malintzin. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, Aztecs, and had already learned Maya during her captivity. When paired with the Spanish-speaking friar Geronimo de Aguilar, who knew Maya but not Nahuatl, Malintzin became a crucial linguistic bridge between the Spanish and the indigenous peoples of Mexico. But she was more than a translator. She was a strategist, a cultural interpreter, and eventually a diplomatic force in her own right. She understood the nuances of language, social rank, and power. In council meetings, war talks, and tense negotiations, Malintzin helped Cortés decode a world he could not understand on his own. Through her, Cortés learned of the resentment many people felt toward the Aztecs, especially the brutal tribute system that demanded human lives. Malintzin helped forge alliances, most notably with the Tlaxcalans, sworn enemies of the Mexica. It was through her voice that Cortés promised vengeance, liberation, or protection. Whether those promises were ever meant to be kept is another matter, but her role was indispensable. The Spanish soon baptized her as Doña Marina, and she became a constant presence at Cortés's side, in battle, in court, and even in private. She bore him a son, Martín, one of the first mestizo children in the Americas, symbolizing a union of conquest and collision. To some modern Mexicans, she is a traitor, La Malinche, a symbol of betrayal. But to others, she was a survivor, navigating a world of violence, enslavement, and invasion with intelligence and strength. The truth lies somewhere in between. Malintzin was a woman caught in the sweep of imperial forces far beyond her control, yet she wielded more influence than nearly any indigenous person in the conquest of Mexico. Without her, Cortés would have been deaf and blind in a hostile and intricate land. With her, he could negotiate, deceive, threaten, and manipulate entire civilizations. In the shadows of conquest, where swords gleamed and temples burned, it was often her voice, calm, clear, and deadly compelling, that carved the path to empire. And so, one of the greatest empires in the New World began to tremble, not just under the weight of steel and gunpowder, but under the whisper of a woman's translation. The journey inland began not with a battle, but with whispers, alliances, and a growing sense of destiny. Hernán Cortés, now firmly in command of his expedition, led his men away from the coastal settlement of Veracruz and toward the heart of the Mexica Empire, Tenochtitlan, the city of gold, gods, and blood. But the road was not empty. The lands of Mesoamerica were densely populated, politically fragmented, and marked by intense tensions. City-states known as Altepetl ruled over themselves, but were often forced to pay tribute to the Mexica. Many resented it. Cortés, with Malintzin always by his side, exploited every fracture. The first actual confrontation came with the Tlaxcalans, a fiercely independent people who had long resisted Aztec domination. They viewed the Spanish with suspicion and launched a brutal series of ambushes against the invaders. For 2 weeks, Cortés's army suffered attacks from Tlaxcalan warriors armed with obsidian blades and clubs. But the Spanish had steel, horses, and cannons, and they held their ground. After fierce fighting and failed negotiations, the Tlaxcalans realized the Spanish might be the key to finally breaking free of Mexica control. An alliance was formed, not out of love, but out of mutual benefit. The Tlaxcalans provided thousands of warriors and served as guides, scouts, and shock troops. Without them, Cortés would never have reached the Valley of Mexico. From there, the march resumed through Cholula, one of the wealthiest cities in Mesoamerica and a sacred religious site. But something dark unfolded there. Cortés claimed to receive intelligence that the Cholulans were planning a massacre of the Spaniards, possibly under orders from Moctezuma himself. In response, Cortés struck first. In a chilling episode, Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces slaughtered thousands of unarmed Cholulan nobles inside temple courtyards. The massacre sent shockwaves through the region. Whether the threat was real or fabricated remains a matter of debate. But the message was clear. Cortés would not hesitate to destroy. His army was not just marching, it was conquering, one city at a time. Meanwhile, reports of the Spanish arrival reached Moctezuma II, the Emperor of the Mexica. From his throne in Tenochtitlan, he received messengers bearing tales of men with pale skin, thunderous weapons, and beasts that breathed fire. Some whispered that Quetzalcoatl, the god who had promised to return, had arrived. Moctezuma hesitated. He sent gifts, gold, jade, and feathered cloaks, in hopes that the strangers might be satisfied. But the gifts only fed the hunger for conquest. Cortés saw the wealth of the Mexica and believed it was his destiny to claim it. By November 1519, after months of marching, battling, and forging uneasy alliances, Cortés stood before the great causeways leading to Tenochtitlan, the city of floating palaces and sacred temples rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco. What he saw defied belief. The city shimmered like a dream. Wide canals crisscrossed the metropolis. Towering pyramids pierced the sky. And at its center stood Moctezuma's palace, the heart of an empire. The Spanish had arrived. But they were not guests. They were a storm cloaked in velvet diplomacy. And soon, the heart of the empire would invite them in. When Moctezuma II finally laid eyes on Hernán Cortés, it was not across a battlefield, but on a causeway, under the watching eyes of an empire. The Mexica ruler had made a decision that stunned his court. He would welcome the Spaniards into Tenochtitlan. Why? Some say Moctezuma believed Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, come to reclaim his throne. Others argue it was a political calculation, an attempt to observe, delay, or manipulate the invaders while maintaining order in a city on edge. Perhaps it was fear. Or maybe it was faith. Whatever his motive, the emperor met the foreign general with gifts, flowers, incense, and reverence. Cortés responded by embracing him, a taboo gesture in the highly ritualized world of Mexican nobility. From the beginning, it was clear. Two worlds with entirely different codes of power had collided. Moctezuma housed Cortés and his army within the palace of Axayacatl, providing them with comfort, food, and security. But the Spaniards were not naive. They knew their position was dangerous, outnumbered and surrounded in a city of hundreds of thousands. So Cortés made his most audacious move yet. Within days, he took Moctezuma hostage. The emperor of the most powerful empire in the Americas became a prisoner in his own palace. To the outside world, Moctezuma remained the Tlatoani, the great speaker of the Mexica. He performed rituals, gave public appearances, and maintained the facade of sovereignty. But inside his chambers, he was under Spanish guard, his authority reduced to performance. Cortés used Moctezuma like a puppet. The emperor ordered his governors and priests to obey the Spaniards. He sent gold, ornaments, and tributes. The temples of Tenochtitlan were defiled as Spanish soldiers placed crosses and images of the Virgin Mary atop sacred pyramids. Resistance simmered, but Moctezuma pleaded with his people for calm. And still, the Spaniards were not satisfied. They demanded more gold, more gifts, more loyalty. Cortés dispatched expeditions to conquer other regions, even as he sat in the heart of an empire he did not yet understand. Meanwhile, far from Tenochtitlan, trouble brewed. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, enraged that Cortés had disobeyed his orders, sent a punitive force under Pánfilo de Narváez to arrest him. Cortés left Tenochtitlan under the command of Pedro de Alvarado and marched east to confront his fellow Spaniards. He defeated Narváez in a surprise attack, then convinced the defeated soldiers to join his army. Now stronger than ever, Cortés turned back toward Tenochtitlan. But what he returned to was not the city he had left. While he was away, Alvarado had massacred hundreds of Mexican nobles during a religious festival, fearing an uprising. The illusion of peace was shattered. The people revolted. The streets of Tenochtitlan erupted in fury. And Moctezuma? The puppet emperor, the hostage king, tried one last time to calm his people from the palace rooftop. Stones flew. His own people struck him down. The empire was awakening, and the Spaniards would soon pay for their arrogance in blood. Tenochtitlan had turned from silent awe to burning rebellion. By the summer of 1520, the Spanish presence in the city had become intolerable. The massacre at the Tenochtitlan festival, ordered by Pedro de Alvarado during Cortés's absence, had desecrated sacred rites and slaughtered honored nobles. The balance shattered. The Mexica people rose. The streets that once echoed with ceremonial drums now roared with war cries. When Cortés returned, he found a city transformed. Barricades, ambushes, fires. The bridges were broken. The causeways were watched. The Spanish, once honored guests, were now besieged invaders. The heart of the Mexica world had become a labyrinth of death. Inside the palace, the body of Moctezuma II lay still. His death, whether by Spanish hand or struck down by his own people, symbolized the collapse of everything that once held order. The Spaniards, trapped in the city's center, now faced annihilation. And so, Cortés planned an escape. On the night of June 30th to July 1st, 1520, under a moonless sky and heavy rain, the Spanish made their move. With stolen gold loaded in chests, carts, and pockets, they attempted to slip away across the Tlacopan Causeway, the narrow road that stretched westward out of the city. It was a gamble soaked in desperation. But the Mexica were ready. As the Spanish crossed the causeway, a cry rang out, and chaos descended. Warriors emerged from the lake in canoes, and others attacked from rooftops. The bridges had been dismantled, leaving gaping canals that the Spaniards tried to cross on planks and makeshift rafts. Many fell into the dark waters, pulled down by the weight of stolen gold. It was a slaughter. Hundreds of Spaniards, Tlaxcalan allies, and enslaved porters died that night. Horses drowned. Cannons were lost. Screams echoed across the lake. Cortés himself barely survived, crossing with only a handful of men and the banner of Castile still in his grip. His once proud army, reduced and bloodied, finally reached safety at the edge of the lake. The survivors wept. History would name it La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But for the Mexica, it was a victory soaked in justice. The Spanish had been humbled. Their alliance with the gods had not saved them. Their hunger for gold had cost them dearly. Yet the war was not over. Cortés retreated to Tlaxcala, where he regrouped. He built ships to return by water. He gathered more indigenous enemies of the Mexica. He wrote letters to Spain, framing his conquest as a holy mission. He was not done. And neither were the Mexica. The empire still stood. The city still shone over Lake Texcoco. But the end was no longer unthinkable. It had begun. The city of Tenochtitlan, once called the Venice of the New World, now stood surrounded, its reflection shimmering in the waters of Lake Texcoco, soon to be stained by siege. After the devastating Night of Sorrows, Cortés retreated to Tlaxcala, licking his wounds and rebuilding his power. But his ambitions had not died on the causeway. In fact, the humiliation only steeled his resolve. This time, he would not return as a guest or hostage-taker. He would return as a conqueror. With the help of his Tlaxcalan allies and additional reinforcements from Cuba, Cortés began constructing brigantines, small warships with sails and cannons designed to command the lake. In a feat of logistical brilliance, he had them built inland, then carried piece by piece over rugged terrain back to Texcoco. There, they were reassembled, turning the calm waters of the lake into a battleground. Inside the city, Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's young nephew and the newly crowned Tlatoani, prepared for war. Charismatic, determined, and defiant, he rallied the remaining strength of the Mexica. Every canal, every temple, every rooftop became a defensive post. The city was divided into 3 main causeways, and each would become a bloody corridor of resistance. In May 1521, the siege began. Cortés launched a 3-pronged assault, using the causeways and his newly constructed ships to cut off supplies. The brigantines destroyed the Mexica canoes, severing the city's lifelines. Meanwhile, his men advanced block by block, capturing and demolishing buildings to avoid ambushes from above. It was urban warfare of brutal intensity. Every street was contested. Every corner was a trap. The Mexica defenders used guerrilla tactics, diving into canals, striking from rooftops, vanishing into the shadows. They fought without armor, outnumbered and starved, but fueled by a desperation to protect their sacred home. Cortés responded with scorched earth. To prevent counterattacks, He ordered every house conquered to be destroyed. The once glorious island city began to resemble a heap of rubble. Hunger gnawed at the population. Disease, especially smallpox, introduced by earlier Spanish expeditions, ravaged the civilians. Tens of thousands died not by sword, but by starvation and sickness. And yet, Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. Week after week, the siege dragged on, 93 days in total. Cortés offered deals. Cuauhtémoc rejected them. Priests continued sacrifices at the great temple. Fires burned along the skyline. Even the lake, once blue and calm, turned murky with blood and floating corpses. By August 1521, the Mexica were broken, but not bowed. The last strongholds of Tenochtitlan fell. Cortés's men pushed into the heart of the city. In a final, desperate act, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape by canoe, but was captured on the lake. According to accounts, he faced the Spanish general and said, "I have done what was my duty to defend my people and my city. Now finish me with your dagger." But Cortés spared him, for now. The great city was no more. Ash and silence settled over Tenochtitlan. A civilization had fallen, but its spirit, its language, its memory, its scars, would endure for centuries to come. The fall of Tenochtitlan in August 1521 did not mark the end of the story. It marked the beginning of a new, far-reaching empire, New Spain. From the smoldering ruins of a shattered city, Hernán Cortés began the process of transforming a native capital into the heart of a European colony. Stones from Aztec temples were repurposed to build Christian cathedrals. Where pyramids once stood, crosses were raised. The ashes of an empire were used to construct the framework of Spanish rule. And at the center of it all, Mexico City, built atop Tenochtitlan's bones. Cortés named himself Captain General and Governor of New Spain, but the Spanish crown soon asserted direct control. In 1524, the Council of the Indies was created in Spain to oversee its vast new colonies. By 1535, a viceroy, the king's official representative, was installed. The first was Antonio de Mendoza, who took charge of a colony already reshaped by war, disease, and forced labor. Spanish rule brought administrative order, but it also institutionalized brutal hierarchies. The encomienda system granted Spanish settlers the right to collect tribute and labor from the indigenous population. In theory, the Spanish were to protect and Christianize those under their charge. In practice, the system was exploitative and deadly. Entire communities were reduced to virtual slavery. Gold, silver, and agricultural production became the priorities of the colony. Massive quantities of precious metals were extracted and shipped to Spain. Indigenous labor was pushed to its limits, and when disease or resistance reduced the workforce, enslaved Africans were imported to fill the gap. The cultural conquest was equally intense. Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries arrived in large numbers, establishing churches, schools, and missions. Native languages were suppressed. Traditional gods were condemned as demons. Sacred codices were burned. In their place, catechisms and Catholic doctrine spread like wildfire. But conversion was never absolute. In remote villages and mountain valleys, old beliefs survived, hidden beneath Christian rituals. Indigenous peoples adopted new names but retained their ancestral customs. They painted crosses beside ancient symbols. The result was a syncretic culture, part Spanish, part indigenous, unique. The social order hardened. A racial caste system, known as the casta system, classified individuals based on their ancestry. Spaniards born in Spain, peninsulares, held the highest status. Those born in the New World, criollos, ranked below. Mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous descent, occupied a middle tier. At the bottom were indigenous peoples, Africans, and enslaved workers. Resistance simmered, even as cities grew and trade expanded. From Chiapas to Michoacán, Uprisings flared. Some were brutally suppressed. Others negotiated fragile autonomy. But the Spanish grip tightened. By the mid-16th century, New Spain was no longer an experiment. It was an empire. Its wealth fueled the Spanish Golden Age. Its laws, culture, and systems would shape Latin America for centuries to come. And yet, beneath its foundations, the voices of the fallen still echoed, of emperors betrayed, temples razed, and civilizations erased and reborn under the banner of the cross and the crown. The conquest of the Aztec Empire reshaped the world, but its legacy, bathed in gold, blood, and silence, has never stopped being debated. In the short term, Spain became the most prosperous empire on earth. The treasures seized from the Aztecs, and later the Incas, poured into Spanish coffers. Galleons crossed the Atlantic laden with silver from Potosi, gold from Mexico, and goods from a growing colonial economy. But what seemed like divine reward came at a human cost. By mid-century, the indigenous population of central Mexico had plummeted by up to 90%, from an estimated 20 million in 1519 to just 2 million by 1600. The causes were many: smallpox, measles, typhus, and the brutal demands of forced labor systems. But above all, it was dispossession, the tearing apart of land, language, and lifeways. Some in Spain questioned the morality of it all. Bartolomé de las Casas, a former encomendero who later became a Dominican friar, emerged as one of the most potent voices in defense of the native peoples. His writings, especially a short account of the destruction of the Indies, denounced the cruelty of the conquest and helped spark legal reforms such as the New Laws of 1542, which aimed to curb the worst abuses of the encomienda system. Yet, in reality, the machinery of empire continued. The conquistadors became legends. Hernán Cortés returned to Spain rich but politically sidelined. He died in 1547, still pleading for recognition. Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec ruler, was hanged by Spanish order during a later expedition to Honduras. His resistance erased from official chronicles for centuries. In Mexico, the memory of the Aztec world was buried under churches, palaces, and Spanish street grids. The Great Temple lay hidden until the 20th century, when excavations began to reveal the truth long buried beneath the Plaza Mayor in Mexico City. But memory, like stone, endures. Today, the Nahuatl language is still spoken by over 1 million people. The calendar, the food, the architecture, echoes of the Mexico world survive in daily life. And in the stories passed down through generations, Cuauhtémoc is a martyr, Tenochtitlan a lost paradise, and the conquest not a glorious beginning, but a tragic rupture. Even in Spain, the golden legacy became tarnished. The wealth from the Americas created inflation, dependency, and debt. Spain's focus on extraction rather than development left its empire fragile. By the 19th century, Latin American revolutions, often led by criollos, would fracture the very empire the conquest had built. And so, 5 centuries later, the legacy of the conquest remains conflicted. Was it triumph or tragedy? Civilization or devastation? Heroism or horror? Perhaps it was all these things, and more. For history is not just what happened, but how we remember it. And in the shadows of Mexico's cathedrals and in the songs of its children, the conquest lives on. Not just as a chapter of the past, but as a question still waiting to be answered. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was not just a military event. It was a pivotal turning point. What began as a clash between 2 empires evolved into something far more complex, a collision of worlds. And though the banners of Castile and Leon rose over the ruins of the Mexica capital, the story of that conquest never truly ended. 500 years later, the ghost of Tenochtitlan walks among us. Modern Mexico City, a sprawling metropolis of over 22 million people, stands where the ancient Aztec capital once shimmered upon Lake Texcoco. Beneath its streets lie layers of stone, memory, and contradiction. The Templo Mayor, buried for centuries beneath colonial buildings, was rediscovered in 1978 during routine electrical work. Today, it stands unearthed, a jagged wound and a shrine, mere steps from the Spanish-built Metropolitan Cathedral, itself raised from the literal stones of the indigenous temple. It is a visual metaphor of Mexico's national identity, conquest and continuity, destruction and endurance. The legacy of the conquest endures not just in ruins, but in the people. Modern-day Mexico is a nation of mestizos, the descendants of both conquerors and conquered. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, still echoes through markets, homes, and rituals. Indigenous festivals, such as the Dia de los Muertos, blend pre-Hispanic and Catholic elements in a syncretic spiritual heritage that resists precise categorization. Yet the wounds of conquest also remain. The racial caste system introduced by the Spanish, though no longer legally enforced, cast a long shadow. Centuries of economic disparity, land dispossession, and cultural erasure have left indigenous communities among the most marginalized in Mexican society. The colonial mindset, though buried, still lingers in assumptions, policies, and prejudice. But memory fights back. In recent decades, a movement has emerged to reclaim indigenous voices, challenge the glorification of conquistadors, and re-examine national myths. Statues of Hernán Cortés have been removed or vandalized. In schoolbooks, once silenced figures like Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, are celebrated as symbols of resistance and dignity. And in 2021, on the 500th anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan, Mexico's government held ceremonies not to commemorate the conquest, but to honor the victims of colonialism. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador publicly apologized to indigenous peoples, acknowledging centuries of oppression. Spain, however, offered no formal apology, a reminder that history is never just in the past. Across the Atlantic, Spain's relationship to its imperial past remains a complex one. The conquest of the Americas, once a source of pride and divine justification, is now viewed through more critical eyes. Historians speak of genocide, cultural annihilation, and economic dependency, rather than just exploration and glory. Monuments are debated, curricula revised, and the once silent victims of history, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, women erased from chronicles, are finally being heard. But this isn't just Mexico's story, nor is it Spain's alone. The conquest of the Aztecs was the first domino in a global transformation. It triggered the Columbian Exchange, a vast movement of plants, animals, people, and diseases between the Old World and the New. Potatoes, corn, and cacao reshaped European diets. Horses, cattle, wheat, and sugar changed the Americas. So did smallpox, influenza, and measles. The world shrank, and the consequences were irreversible. Economically, the flood of silver from the Americas fueled European capitalism, funded wars, and helped shift global power. Politically, the Spanish model of colonization would inspire other empires: Portuguese in Brazil, French in the Caribbean and Canada, British across North America and India. Culturally, the Catholic Church expanded its reach across continents, converting millions and reshaping indigenous beliefs and traditions. Morally, the conquest sparked philosophical and legal debates that remain relevant today. In 1550, the Spanish crown held the Valladolid debate, a formal argument over the morality of colonizing and enslaving indigenous peoples. On one side stood Bartolomé de las Casas, who argued for the humanity and rights of Native Americans. On the other hand, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who claimed the conquest was justified because the natives were inferior and in need of Christian salvation. It was the first time in modern history that a European power publicly questioned whether it had the right to dominate another people. There was no clear winner, but the seeds of international human rights law, however faint, were planted in that room. Those questions of conquest and morality, of power and justice, still haunt the present. In today's world, where statues are toppled, schoolbooks rewritten, and colonial legacies scrutinized, the story of Tenochtitlan and the Spanish conquest remains profoundly relevant. It challenges us to ask, who gets to write history? What truths were buried with the dead? And how do we reconcile pride in cultural heritage with the pain of historical trauma? There are no easy answers, but perhaps the true legacy of the conquest is not gold or glory, nor ruin or rubble, but memory itself, the refusal to forget. The insistence that beneath the skyscrapers and subways of modern cities, there once stood temples. Before the cross, there was the sunstone. Before the empire, there was the eagle on the cactus, and that, despite it all, the people survived. In the end, Tenochtitlan did not die. It transformed. Its stones still speak. Its people still remember. Its empire, though fallen, echoes in every corner of the Americas, where names like Chichen, Texcoco, Tlaxcala, and Cuauhtémoc still live on. History is not just a tale of the victors. It is a chorus of the lost, the silenced, the survivors. And in that chorus, the Aztec voice still sings.